Hi, thank you very much for joining us. I'm Jean Hale and I work for Culture Bridge North East, producing the CreatED Classrooms programme, of which this is part. We've got a series of 3 sessions on art and design coming up. This is the first, and it'll be delivered by Rachel Thompson from Access Art, and she'll tell you a little bit more about that.
Hi everybody, welcome to the session this morning. It's really nice to see you all. We will be doing lots of practical exercises this morning, but we will be also be inviting you to sort of share some thoughts. Okay, so today really we're thinking about drawing. The session is obviously called Drawing Without Knowing, and it really just kind of embraces the idea that when we are drawing, it doesn't always matter if we don't know what it is what we are going to end up with, and it's through that process that we can actually discover some of the really hidden inspirations behind drawing. I want you to think about opening out what drawing is, and also what it can be, and also what it is to you. So we're all a group of people with different backgrounds, and some of you may be really familiar with art or with drawing. You may be artists. Others might not have worked in that area before, or if you're a teacher, you might not feel hugely confident with drawing or with art. So this session really is for you. It's for you to have a gentle sort of tap into your own creativity, which of course we all do have, and we all know how challenging and busy life can be, and it can often feel quite difficult to keep tuned in with our sense of who we are creatively. So I wanted to sort of support that this morning. So the thing to say mainly about drawing is that there are many different ways of drawing, and we might sort of, when we think about drawing, we might think about a sort of slightly technical way of drawing, but it's important to remember that it is more than a technical skill, and it's also more than something we can do for relaxation. So it's sort of, I see drawing as a kind of a spectrum. So we might have sort of really finely tuned technical drawing at one end of that spectrum, all the way down to really gestural, expressive mark making that we might use as a means of relaxing, just kind of sweeping materials across the page. And then it's sort of everything in between as well. So I think when we're talking to children about drawing, it's important that from a very young age that they understand there are different ways of doing it. And what that does is that it enables children to feel a sense of reassurance that the way that they find their drawing voice is okay, because there's lots of different ways and there's no right and wrong with it. And it is something that, within our UK system, our school system, it can be quite easy to inadvertently close down what drawing is. And an example of this would be to only concentrate on something like shading, so looking at an object, placing an emphasis on representational drawing. And of course that is absolutely valid and totally something that is fun to do as well. But if we only do that, or if we only concentrate on the more technical side of drawing, there is the possibility that you can alienate children who respond better and create more exciting outcomes using a different type of drawing, like expressive mark making or whatever it is. So if we're providing those opportunities and we are keeping experiences as open as possible, then we are providing a really well-rounded educational experience for the children that we're working with. So I was thinking about how you can sort of define what drawing is in a sort of sentence, and it is quite a tricky one to really pin down, but I think, and one of the things we say, I work for Access Art, and which is an organisation that supports visual arts education in schools. I'm also an artist as well, and one of the things that we say on Access Art is that drawing is an exploration of marks made on the surface with different intentions, and that word intention is quite critical there. And when we're talking about curriculums, we often say, we think about how we can form the intention behind our curriculum. So drawing in the same way is a whole range of different marks with a whole range of different contexts on surfaces with a different intention. So these intentions can be things like expressing emotions. It can be to capture the likeness of an object or a person. It can be thinking through an idea. I mean, literally sort of having thoughts, getting them down on paper in some visual way. in order to refine and develop those ideas. It can be also to explain something, so to annotate is if you were sort of doing a drawing that involves annotation or diagrams, that is a form of drawing. It's a form of drawing that is about explaining something. So the intentions are limitless, really. There's lots of different intentions behind drawing. But today we are not going to be looking at drawing through a technical lens. This is mainly because I think it's to not do that is a great way to loosen anybody up creatively. We're also doing that today because that is essentially my practice. My practice as an artist is very much about process-led drawing and painting and layering materials together. So the activities that we do today are ones that happen in school classrooms, and also activities that I myself do as an artist in order to kind of generate and gather and refine. So, but that's not to say, if we're not talking about technical drawing, it's not to say that we won't be having the opportunity to develop skills. And I think that's a misconception that is important to raise, is that just because we're not doing technical drawing doesn't mean we're not learning skills. And we are learning skills, and we're building knowledge as well. So it isn't a skill, drawing isn't a skill that can be learned and is then complete. Artists who draw evolve their skills over many years, and it can weave in and out and go up and down, and it can follow the sort of track of our creativity. So that's just the final point I wanted to say about drawing. And I wanted to just read you a quote from there's a school called the Royal Drawing School. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. It's been going quite a number of years now, and they've got a wonderful book called Ways of Drawing. And I was saying earlier to Jean that after this session, I can send around some links to some things that I've mentioned today and some of the wider reading. But I just thought that this quote was a really lovely way to start our session. Drawing is at the heart of expression in every medium. It gives people a visual understanding that they might not otherwise find. And it doesn't matter whether you're drawing with wax or paint or clay. What is important is that drawing can access the electric current through which art is made. And that's Catherine Goodman, who's one of the founders of so I just wanted to read that out because I thought that was quite a nice little quote. And what I wanted to do just briefly before we kick off with a quick warm-up is to very quickly whiz through and just introduce ourselves. It'd be lovely to hear what setting you work in.
I'm Luke Watson. I'm from the Seal First School in Hexham. I've recently become the art leader in the school. I love art, but I think this training is probably quite necessary for me, so I can learn about kind of how to develop the skills and what you were saying before about kind of, technical drawing's got a place, but also learning the other parts of drawing and, building confidence with the children.
Hi everyone. Great, I'm Mel Eaton. I work as a Year 5 teacher and art coordinator at Benton Park Primary School, and I've been teaching since 2003, so feel very old. A little bit confusing because my title says Write Space North East, so I run kind of creative writing workshops in the local community, which is now branched out to actually art craft workshops as well. So I'm kind of here on many different levels.
Lovely. And yeah. the combination of writing and drawing is a lovely thing as well. There's
lovely. Yeah, I love linking it.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Hi, I work for Tyne Museums. I do a lot of art already, but I just thought it'd be really nice just to see. I think it's always good, just like a little bit of CPD for me, but also a bit of mental health and well-being for me as well after like a really busy few months. But I'm about to start working with the outreach team at Tyne Museums as well, and I just thought it'd be just really nice just to sort of refresh some of my skills.
Great, lovely, thank you. That's really interesting. Thanks for joining.
Hello, I'm a primary school teacher as well. I'm also the art lead. I've been the art lead for years and years now, so it's just really nice just to have a refresh, upskill myself, etc. Because I must admit, it's been a long time since I've been on any art courses or anything, so it's just nice to join in and have a bit of a refresh.
Good, welcome. And that's really interesting. You're an art lead, so it sounds like you're really experienced, and I'm sure lots of these activities we did this morning.
Yeah.
But you're right, it is good to refresh and to reconnect, isn't it, with what it is that we're doing. Yeah, thank you. Mandy, I've got Mandy next. Hi, Mandy.
Hiya, I'm a special needs teacher, qualified in primary, and I lead the Arts Award and Arts Mark in the school. But my background is more overall creative background of performing in theatre, and yeah, I can do a bit sketching and, you know, art, but I didn't go down the strict art path. And the nature of our children, you'll have a lot that will be mark making. They are very creative, but not in the traditional sense. So I wanted to go on more courses for my professional development, which will also help, you know, realising that some of our children are drawn in a traditional sense, but we do always have a couple every year that might be able to achieve a bit higher on the Arts Award. Maybe looking towards bronze now. We are starting to get a couple of pupils like that. So it's really just to give me probably more skills in teaching that and supporting them, and actually maybe just recognising what's happening anyway and to pass on to the staff, really, just to channel more in an art direction itself rather than overall creativity.
Yes. And that's often a challenge for you know, if you're a teacher in a school, you're the art lead, or you're somehow responsible for training other team members. It can be quite difficult to do that sometimes, to communicate the subject in a session with other teachers to sort of help it infuse within the school, and it is quite a challenge sometimes. That's great. I mean, I always think it's interesting to hear, you know, about education departments within museums and galleries, because they're such important learning spaces, aren't they? And also the relationships between those organisations and with schools, and how important those connections are. Okay, well, I think that's everybody for now. But as Danny said earlier, or Jean said earlier, you know, this session is supposed to be informal. So if anything pops up that you want to check or ask, please do just jump in, and that's absolutely fine. If you'd rather do that in the chat box, that's totally fine. That'll likely be Danny picking that up rather than me, and then she might ask out the question to me in case I don't see it. But I think we'll just crack on. So we're going to start with a really quick, short warm-up just to kind of get you going. You probably all have heard, well, you might have heard of continuous line drawing. So we're going to do a very short activity on that. And just to quickly say, I hope you've got some materials with you around gathered. So if you haven't, just gather them around a bit. We'll need some paper. We've got I've got some sugar paper, newsprint, watercolor paper. But for this, we're just going to use cartridge paper. Whatever you've got around is fine. And we're going to be using a handwriting pen. So that could be a biro, it can be a Sharpie, that kind of thing. And I've got my screen I'm going to share. Can you see my visualizer screen now, everybody? Yeah. So I've got an immense amount of sunlight just sort of suddenly coming into where I'm at. So it kind of looks a bit slightly blinding. I hope you can actually see okay. Okay, let me shuffle along a little bit. Okay, so hopefully you got a few little objects as well. So I just invite you to choose one of your objects. So if you haven't got anything pre-collected, just grab something now that's close to you. That can be, you know, a set of keys. It could be something that's on your desk. Plants work really well for continuous line. And really the aim of this activity, continuous line, is careful looking. So we're really focusing on looking very carefully at an object. And I would like you to just, when you're ready, begin to just get your sort of hand nice and relaxed. So I always say, you know, try and get your, you know, hands and your wrists nice and relaxed before doing drawing. And the idea of continuous line drawing is to make sure that you are looking at your object, but not at the paper. Okay, and you just keep your eyes on the object. My pen isn't working as well. And just begin to move your eyes around the object in front of you. And as you move your eyes, just trace that line of sight with your drawing tool. I've got a sort of candlestick here. I'm drawing along, but I'm inviting you to, I'm demonstrating, but I'm inviting you to draw along with me as well. And you're fine with continuous line. You know, you lose your bearings very quickly. I've completely lost where I am really. I don't really know what I'm, you know, but that's okay. And actually, sometimes with continuous line, you can end up with something that is really quite an interesting set of marks that almost becomes, it's separate from the object in a way. It becomes its own force. So just gently keep moving your pen around. And if you want to try, if you see some tone or value within your object, just try and mark that in. I mean, I'm doing that now, but I don't really know if I'm in the right place, but again, doesn't really matter. I've chosen quite a challenging object for this actually, and what's interesting is to try this out with different objects. You know, give the children a sort of choice, and it's an activity that can repeat. So you might do it one week using natural forms like shells and pebbles, and then the next week you might try it with things like toy cars or playing with little figures or something like that. And just invite the children to notice the variation in challenge. Okay. I think I've got to the edge of my paper, so what I need to do now is I'm going to travel all the way back up to where I think I started, and I'm just going to add in the candle because I've got a candle in here. And what's lovely with the continuous line is that reassurance that, okay, if you feel like you've hit the end of the object or you've hit the end of your paper and you need to travel to a different part of your drawing, then you still keep your pen on the paper, you don't lift it off. And so you end up with a sort of additional line that isn't obviously in front of you, but nevertheless, it becomes an interesting mark on the paper that really adds to the character of the drawing. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Just give you a minute to finish up yours. Okay, so if you want to sort of finish the mark that you're making, have a look at what you've done. And hopefully you have got something quite interesting in front of you, and you might see bits of resemblance to what your object was. You might not, but what you will hopefully see is a sort of nice, kind of an interesting way in which lines and marks can collide and interact. So this activity is, as I said, great for careful looking, for getting your eyes off the page, and children find that quite a challenge to lift their eyes off from what they're actually doing. They can get quite stuck into a drawing being perfect, being right. You know, for this activity, you do not need rubbers or erasers. You know, they are absolutely don't have a role in this drawing activity at all. So it's about the children learning that it's the looking behind the drawing that is the focus here, and what they end up with. There's no right or wrong way of drawing it, and there's certainly no need to rub it out. It's a great activity for transitioning between different points of the day in the school. I know not all of you are in schools, but you know, whatever activity that you're running, it's a great warm-up. It's a great way to, you know, if children are coming in busy from lunch and they need to settle down into the afternoon activities, it's a great way to sort of ease them into it. So I would recommend it for those sort of punctuating the day in that using continuous line. We've obviously drawn our objects here, but it's also a great, you can then extend it. And if you were thinking, for example, about a still life project, so you might begin with a continuous line of various objects, which then develops and leads into doing more of a refined still life piece. And then what you're doing is you're building on those skills of the careful looking by doing the sort of, you do the warm-ups and then you do the final piece, as it were. Although when I say final piece, I really use that term loosely because I don't really use that term myself. No piece is really ever that final. So yeah, and also for figures as well. So if you're doing figurative drawing, again, looking at the body, if you drawing from life, you know, really carefully looking at the figure, getting the figure down on the page, and not worrying so much about the exact the likeness really of all the anatomy. Okay, we're going to move on to some charcoal next. I'm a big fan of charcoal. I've just swapped my paper over. I've now got some newsprint. Newsprint is super cheap. You can buy it in great big wads. and it's really, really great for charcoal. It's got a sort of sheeny, almost shiny kind of surface. It's not absorbent really, so charcoal is great for that surface. It kind of glides over and is easily kind of worked into and rubbed out. So charcoal, really, really great for larger gestural drawing, sort of working out big ideas or working out small ideas, but doing it in a kind of loose way. You're never going to get a sort of super detailed charcoal drawing. It's always going to be a relatively thick line of drawing. So it's great for sketching something out quite quickly. It's great for large scale work as well, because you can cover a lot of space quite efficiently with charcoal. It's obviously quite a dramatic black colour against the paper that you're working on. It's used a lot in life drawing for that reason, just to kind of mark out a figure quickly on the page. And you might do several of those to sort of build up where you're working towards with your figurative drawing. So for this activity, if you just get your charcoal in front of you, hopefully you've got some. This activity is really about reducing down what we're seeing into shapes. So what I'd like you to do is I'm inviting you to look across the room from where you are. Find, it doesn't have to be directly across, but somewhere in the room that you're in, and to just focus in on a little view, as if you've kind of made a viewfinder with your own eyes. Just to find a pocket of space within the room, and just take in the object that you see. So whether that's a table or a window or whatever it is, just take them in and just notice how they interact and how they collide. So if children were doing this in the classroom, you know, invite them to look into different spaces. You know, maybe there's a sort of a set of trays. That's an interesting structure. Maybe there's a nice sort of display board on the wall that sits next to a plant or something, and just sort of get them to notice that little pocket of area, and just to sort of zoom in on it. And what I'd like you to do, when you've sort of found your area, I'd like you to work quite quickly and not think too much about it, and just mark out some of the details of what you're seeing in simple form and on large scale as well. So just to quickly demonstrate, I'm looking over a window here, and I'm just going to come straight up here, and I've got a plant pot here, and I'm just marking it in. And then that plant pot collides with the window, so I can have a line coming up here. Plant pot comes down with that window there. And then from behind the plant pot, I've got a photo, just a loose photo that's just kind of popping out, slightly comes under like that. And then carrying on the windowsill there. And then if I come to the other side of the plant pot, I've got another little photo that's smaller. And then just move it there a bit. There's my other photo. And the window sort of comes out. Charcoal snaps all the time, don't worry if that happens. Okay. So hopefully you can see that I've just drawn a series of lines. That's all I've done. But I have been looking at what I've been seeing. So I just invite you to just do something similar. So we're marking out, we're sort of condensing it into really simple form. So it's like splitting the page up into shapes. That is essentially what we're doing. And this really does need to be on a slightly larger scale. And I've actually worked on a smaller piece than I would probably normally do for this, just so it fits in the visualizer, but I would encourage, where possible, to vary the scale in which, if you're delivering a session, to vary that scale as much as possible, and to make sure children have got experience working on a small scale and on a large scale. Okay, so if you've marked out you've reduced your shapes down, you've marked them out on your page, I'd now like you to take a piece of kitchen roll or a rag or something, tissue, and to rub it out. So rub into it, smudge it around. It's not going to disappear completely. It would probably more with an actual rubber, but I'm very deliberately not using an actual rubber. I'm using just a bit of kitchen roll. And as you're doing it, just be in that moment of watching the charcoal smudge and move, and just notice the effect it creates. What I always love about charcoal is that it gives such a sense of movement when it's rubbed out. It's almost like those objects are kind of beginning to move and merging. And that becomes even more clear if you're drawing, what you start drawing with is a figure or something that is slightly more of an organic shape. I've obviously got some quite angular shapes here. Okay. So if you will just rub that out. Okay. Next, then I'd like you to just take your piece of paper and just turn it upside down. So then you're looking at it from the other way up. Okay. And then suddenly now you see that you've just got something quite different in front of you. And then I'd like you to repeat the activity again. So we're going to do the same thing and just find a different little section of the room that you're in. And do the same again. So I'm going to go somewhere else. Where should I go? I'm going to go over here towards this, and I've got another line coming along here. So I'm working over the top. And this time we're not doing continuous lines, so you can look down at the paper. So keep looking up, keep looking down. Try not to look down too much, but keep your eyes on what you're seeing. And again, just reducing it down into these simple forms. Okay, I've got a line going across there. So just keep working into it. And as you are doing so, just observe the interaction between the darker lines that you've just done and their relationship with the blurred out, the rubbed out lines, the knocked back lines that you had before. And just notice what they look like together. And you might think, oh, well, actually, this little section here looks quite interesting. I'm going to move my paper a bit. This little section here is quite interesting. I've got this object here, but I like that these smudged lines sort of come down that same shape. So I might sort of start working into those lines a bit more. And as you start doing that, as you start working back into it, something just begins to appear, okay? And we can use our fingers and we can smudge it back again. And we can experiment with introducing some, I've got this quite nice, just this blank space here. I'm just going to fill that in. So what's happening now is that I'm looking less at what I'm seeing. So I'm not looking up so much at the objects I'm drawing, and I'm shifting, my focus is shifting now slightly more towards just on the paper, because what I'm doing now is I'm using the marks that I have made and I'm thinking through ways that I can bring out those marks, how I might develop them and what they might become. And I don't know what they're going to become, but what I like is that you start to almost allow the shapes to evolve and to gather their own momentum. And this is a really great activity to help detach from the outcome. So, you know, to help hopefully alleviate the pressure of, you know, a child might say, well, I can't draw and it's not quite right. And I have, you know, it doesn't look like what I, you know, all those things that come into all, you know, we all feel those things. But this is a really nice activity to just kind of, we're putting that to one side. We're just seeing what comes out on the page. That's what we're doing. But you are still developing those skills and careful looking as well. Okay, and this activity can, you can repeat this again. So you could then invite your group, if you're working with a group, to knock it back again with your rag, and turn the paper over again and carry on. Or you might want to introduce a really bright colour and do the same with a bright coloured pastel. So there's ways in which you can adapt and evolve it. Charcoal, newsprint, or charcoal on sugar paper is a great material to use if you are talking, for example, about cave art or any kind of ancient civilization. And we're really sort of tapping into historical drawing tools. There's something really lovely and primal about charcoal. Obviously, you can tell the children how it's made. It's burnt. It's charcoal wood, and it's an ancient drawing tool, going right back through to the earliest civilizations and the earliest drawings that we know about today that are in caves. So it's a lovely way you can begin with something like this, and you can lead into looking at some examples of cave art. Obviously, they used other things like iron oxide as well, so you can bring in some beautiful pastels in that kind of colour. You can actually buy them in that colour. So it's a nice way to sort of lead into that wider discussion surrounding drawing. Okay, right. Okay, we're going to move on now to, I'm going to just turn, I'm going to, my sugar paper. So if you'd like now to just pick up an HB pencil or a drawing pencil, slightly softer is always better, I'd say, with drawing. If you are doing drawing in your class, try to use something like a 2B pencil. HB is a little bit too hard, you don't get such a great line. So soft-ish pencil, I would say. And we're going to be closing our eyes for this activity, and we're going to be drawing through touch. That's basically what we're doing. So you can do this in a number of different ways. One way is to hold an object in your hand to give the children the object. They can hold it behind hold their hand behind their back. You can give them an object, and they have to feel that object and draw what they're feeling. We're actually going to do something else where we're going to be just gently touching our own faces. So just go with me. I know it sounds a bit strange, but just shut your eyes, and I'd like you to just gently begin to move your hand over where your brow line is in your eye, and just to begin with just feeling. So you don't need to draw right now, but just observe and be in that moment where we're just thinking about, okay, the structure of my brow line, where does the brow begin, where do the contours go in and out. Okay, and then when you're ready, I'd just like you to just start drawing at the same time as what you're feeling. Okay, so it may be you might want to just very softly do some lines for your eyebrow. And I'm just going to give you a moment to do that as I'm going to just try and shift my visualizer slightly. So you carry on, and just for a couple of minutes, this activity is really good with the eyes closed, but you don't have to close your eyes. So just keep your hand just moving around your face a little bit. Try to not look at the paper again. I mean, you can, but what's nice is that you're drawing through a different sense, and you're engaging with not just pencil on paper, but you're engaging at the same time with touch. And so it's actually a really nice activity to do when you want a little bit of quiet in the classroom or the setting you're in. It's quite an engaging activity. You can kind of really lose yourself in that very simple physical movement of your hand over your face. Okay, so when you finish the line you're on, just pause for a moment and just have a look at what it is that you've drawn. and just observe it. Just observe the lines, observe if there's any variation in the thickness of those lines. Did you sort of naturally turn your pencil more on its point, or did you lean it down slightly more to make a thicker, more shaded line over certain areas? Can you recognise the different contours of your face? How easy is that to do? And just connect with the thoughts and the reflections surrounding it. You know, what was challenging about it? And I'm not sure if anybody feels like they would like to share any thoughts on it, but do feel free to just unmute and just contribute any thoughts that you have. It's absolutely fine. You know, it's a good sort of it's always good to kind of practice just when we've done a drawing to just sit with it for a bit and pause with it, not just to help us understand what it was about it that's gone right or wrong, as it were, but also just to take a moment to make sure that we are just in the present, and it's good for children to sort of to get into that habit. The day is very busy, it's very quick, and it's quite nice to slow down for a moment. Would anybody like to hold up their face drawing? Does anybody feel they would like to do that? Let me just move my arrows a little bit here.
This is what I've done.
Okay, let's see, Luke, hold it a bit closer. Yes, great.
Yeah, I kind of got a bit lost, so you can see my nose is above my eyebrows.
Perfect.
But the experience was nice. As you say, it was very relaxing. It was kind of like meditation.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be really useful for the children because they're also afraid of making mistakes.
Yeah.
And I think if I can get them to do this, it'll be huge progress.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think the failure of a mistake is such a big conversation, isn't it? And I think all of these activities, I wanted to do things today that really tried to push back on that bit. And it's, you know, not just for children, but for adults as well. And actually failure or mistakes are incredibly important. It's a really important part of growing as an artist and growing as a drawer. So yeah, great. I mean, one thing that you can do with these, if you wanted to sort of, you could begin with drawing through touch, and then you can buy these little mini mirrors. And a nice follow-on activity to this would be for the children to then really closely look at the same area in a mirror and to do a drawing to the side or nearby to the other one. If they had a sketchbook, maybe they have a double page spread, and on one side they've got their drawing through touch, and on the other side they've got their drawing with a mirror. And actually, as you're going along today, you know, do make a little note on each of your drawings to just remind yourself what the activity was and what it was that we were doing, what we were thinking about, because that's something that's, you know, pinning up your work, pinning up the work that you've done, so, you know, all the children can see it, or, you know, you can sort of pretend you're kind of in a gallery setting. You could leave the work out on tables and invite the children to walk around the space and just to observe each other's work, because it's that sort of shared experience, isn't it? Nobody there would have done a perfect drawing of a face, absolutely nobody. And what you will see is 30 individual approaches, and that's really what you want to aim for when you're teaching art, is that you don't have 30 pieces of work that are the same, because it's too didactic and it's pre-described and predefined what it is that they're actually doing. To enable some exploration is really important. So yeah, pin them up on the wall. You know, you can have a fun discussion, things like, you know, who do you recognise? You know, can you find so and so, whatever. You can also do that if you prefer. You can do that with the object. So if you feel like this, for whatever reason, it might not be quite appropriate or sensitive to be having anything too figurative up on the wall for everyone to sort of be talking about, you know, do that with objects instead. So come in with a big old collection of random objects, give the child an object behind their back for them to not look at, but to feel it and then to draw it. And then up on the wall, you know, what objects can we identify? And try it with a different material. So we just used pencils there, but by all means, again, try with handwriting pens. Also, even with paint, you could try it with paint as well. You might get some more tone in there as well. Okay, right, we are talking of paint. We're going to move on to some paint now. before I do, has anybody got any other questions they wanted to ask before we move on away from the dry materials for a little bit?
Would you do it in the same time as you've done it with us, or would you give children longer or not as long? How would you kind of?
Well, I would say 5
gauge it?
minutes. Yeah, I would say about 5 minutes for that particular one. Yeah, not too long. Doesn't need to be too long, really. Same for the continuous line at the beginning. You know, it's a 5 minutes of activity, but of course an activity that can and should be repeated and layered. So you might do it each week. You might have more often than that. You know, you might have it available for the children to do every day, just as 5 minute little kind of brain break activity every day.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, about 5 minutes I'd say is fine for that one. Okay, so we'll move on to some paint now. I've moved my screen a little bit. Now looks a bit wonky, but hopefully that's slightly less light on the screen. You can see it better. Okay, now I've got some watercolor paper here. Hopefully you've got some. If you don't have watercolor paper, don't worry. I mean, thick cartridge paper is fine, or cartridge paper is a good substitute for watercolor paper. But anyway, get that in front of you, and also some watercolor paints. Just have those to hand for now, and you'll need your water pot and a brush. And we're just going to begin with saturating our paintbrushes with water. I'll just show you the brushes I've got. I've got this one here on the right. This one here is called a mop brush. I'm not suggesting all schools have it. I know I'm totally aware of budget constraints. If you can have a few larger brushes or sponges for using watercolor, then that's great. I've got a little sponge here as well. I'd just like you to begin with wetting your brush. I'm going to do a very, very simple watercolor technique, which is always a winner with kids because it's really fun. It's called the wet on wet technique, and I mean, I use it a lot with my own painting. It's a sort of lovely way to create a kind of wash and a backdrop to something you might add to it later on. And we're going to be thinking about circles for a bit, just a few minutes. We're going to think about circles and the sort of the movement of how we can do them. And I just invite you to just take your brush with your water and just very slowly, and watching it as you go, make a circle with the water. You won't be able to see very much. You probably can't see what I'm doing that well here either. That doesn't matter right now. Just focus on slowly creating a circle on the page. And when you've gone around a few times, get a bit more water and carry on, and slowly work your way outwards. So this is a great way also to just practice paintbrush skills quite simply. I mean, it sounds really straightforward, but actually paintbrush skills take quite a long time. And especially when children are learning, there's that intense activity surrounding learning their writing and how they hold pencils, and it can be immensely challenging. So it's a really nice opportunity to just engage with a paintbrush. Okay, so I've got quite a lot of water on here now. My circle's got a bit bigger, and hopefully you guys have got plenty of water on your paper as well. Okay. Okay, so we're going to move away from the water, and I'm going to get my paints here actually. Choose a colour. I've got some blue here. I'm going to swap my paintbrush out. I'm going to use a slightly, that was a very thick, very big brush. I'm going to go a little bit smaller now. This one here. This is just a round-headed brush. You'll need round-headed rather than flat-headed for watercolour for this activity certainly. And what I always say with watercolour is you want to make a puddle, right? So I've actually got I've got liquid one in a tube, but I also have it in this palette. So I'm going to do a bit of a combination of the two, but just to show you, I always say just get plenty of water in the palette so that you make a puddle. This is particularly important with normally the colours that are the paints that schools have are those red tins. I think it's Reeves, I think is the brand. They're fine, they're absolutely fine, but they're not as saturated as some of the other brands. And you know, I know you won't be able to have the expensive brands in school, but all the more reason to make sure that the children know about creating a puddle. Okay, so I've got plenty of paint on my brush now, plenty of water. got a bit of my extra there. I'm just going to do that. And then once you've got your lots of paint in a brush, I'd like you to just find the sort of wet circle on your page and just dab the paint in. So dab that, sort of transferring that puddle, and just take a moment to watch it. So it does a really lovely thing, just very beautifully starts bleeding into the paper. Okay, and when you feel it starting to slow down, go back into your water and beginning with heading to the outside of that shape, the outer parameters of that shape that's now been created. Go back in with your water and follow that shape. And you should see that it creates more of a puddle for that paint to bleed into. And we're following this circle, so we're going in a circle. Hopefully you can see mine okay. So again, just observe how the paint is moving. It doesn't matter what colour you do this with. I always lean towards blues and greys and blacks, but you can try any colour. At this point, what we want is to create a bit of a wash, so we're not going to go too heavy on the saturation of the colour at this point. Okay, so mine stopped moving again now. So this time I'm going to go back in, I'm going to get a bit more of the paint. And I'm just now going to have a play, and I invite you to just have a play with this paint, okay? So I'm just going to go back in, and already that colour is mixing now with the extra water I added in, and I'm just slowly moving it around. And it naturally pools and it puddles, and some areas are darker and more saturated and some are lighter. And I'm just following this circle. And you'll begin to feel, so again, really connecting in a sensory level with the materials you're working with, you'll begin to feel when the paper is becoming drier. So when you've reached the outer edges of the water circle that you made at the beginning, okay? And then it's up to you, you know, think about it. How do you want to disrupt this circle? Do you want to add some more water in at this point? If you do, go ahead and do it. Do you want to add a bit more colour? Maybe you want to add a slightly different colour. Let's see. I've got a darker blue here. Let's move this bit. I've got a darker blue. And I'm just going to see what happens when I go into the palest part of the circle. Just see what happens. You know, vary the marks that you're doing. So with paintbrushes, we can do this lovely sweeping movements, but we can also do some dots. This activity also works really, really well. Watercolour is amazing with pipettes. So you can buy these sort of plastic pipettes, which last obviously a long time. And if you make these big puddles of the paint, and you can do that in trays as well. And then you teach the children to sort of suck up the paint into the pipette and then drop it down onto a watered piece of watercolour paper. and it's a lovely, it's sort of magical, really. They find it really magical. Okay, so I'm just going to allow you to just take a moment to just figure out what you want to do with that paint. You know, where do you want it to go? Do you want that darker area in the middle to be spread out to the rest of the circle? Or do you want to add some more in there and make it darker in the middle? Do you want to add some more water to the outside to see if you can get more of the bleeding? You just have a little, I'll give you a moment to just play around for a little bit. So what we're asking really, if we're doing this with children, is to invite them to follow their instinct. Okay, so we're saying to them, look, this is your piece of paper, this is the paint that you're using. You're showing them a technique. The wet on wet technique is a very well-known, taught, sort of technical, as it were, watercolour skill. But you are giving them that skill, that knowledge, but you are allowing them to just explore it. And we are not creating anything. I haven't said to you, we are drawing this. We're discovering the material and what it can do. It might become something later, but that's another conversation. Okay, just another few seconds on this before we move on. We're going to actually come back to it, but we're going to put it to one side. Okay, so when you are ready, if you'd like to just push your paints back away from your workspace and take your watercolour painting and put it gently to one side, because what we're going to do is come back to that when it's a little bit dry, and it shouldn't take too long. It obviously depends how much water you have, but it does dry relatively quickly. So if you pop it to one side, okay, and then I've got a clean, fresh piece of paper here. I've just got some sugar paper. Anybody got any questions before we carry on?
Lena's asked, what watercolour paper would you recommend?
I would say that with watercolour paper, the most absorbent you can afford is the best. It would be better. And there's something called cold pressed and something called hot pressed. And actually now I can't remember which is which. One is more absorbent than the other. I tend to buy it by touch, so I'll go in normally and actually feel it. And if it feels rough and bobbly, then it's really good. But obviously with school supplies, you'll be ordering online. You definitely want it to be as thick as you can get it, really. There isn't a particular, I mean, you can get it anywhere. It's often unbranded, you know. I would say just get the best that you can. And if you can't get watercolour paper, then cartridge paper does work. It's just not going to give you the same amount of movement, you know, the bleeding effect is not going to be as effective on cartridge paper. And you certainly wouldn't get watercolours. You can paint them onto sugar paper or newsprint, but you would never get the absorbency. That's not to say you can't use them with that, but with that paper. But for this particular, if you're talking about wet on wet technique and the wet on dry technique, which is what we'll do in a moment, you do need watercolour paper or thick cartridge paper.
Before we move on, John's asked, do you paint on the rough side?
They're both sides are rough normally. It's normally the same each side. Yeah. There's sometimes a bit of variation, but you can normally tell with touch. There's a lovely paper called Khadi papers, Khadi, I think it's spelled, which is cotton rag paper, I think. So it's not quite the same thing. But that's really lovely paper with watercolour paint. But not exactly, probably not great for a school budget. But okay, so you've got some objects with you, hopefully from earlier. Just a few little things in front of you. Just checking the time. We haven't got that long, have we? So we're just going to do a really quick activity. I call it finding lines. It hopefully will become apparent why. So I'd like you to just, with the objects that you have, just cluster them together. So they're sort of together, but not on top of each other, but sort of in the line, but maybe one slightly in front. So there's an overlap. So I've got a candlestick, I've got a little jug, and I've got a little bell in the shape of a lady, a metal bell. And I've put them so they're sort of together in a little composition. And when you're doing this with children, this is a perfect opportunity to talk about composition, to look at objects, to align them, to think about how they interact and how they collide. And then I'd like you to you can choose really whether you want your to use pencil or charcoal or pen, or if you want to use some colour. So I've actually got some chalk pastels here, so I think I'm going to go straight in. There's some chalk pastels here. I'm going to go straight in with. I'm going to go really bright just so you can really see it. And I'd like you to just find one line in one of your objects, and just without thinking too much, just get that line on the page. Okay, so there, I've just done it quickly. So this really is about working quite fast. We are looking, but we're not getting too caught up in detail at this point. That's one object. Then I'd like you to do the same for your another object and ensure that that line collides or interacts somehow with the line you've just done. So I'm going to come down here and I've got this bell and it comes out with a little arm and then following it all the way up. So I've actually done the whole of almost the whole shape of this little lady. She's like a little kind of milkmaid bell. I don't quite know the story behind why that's in my house, but there we are. And so I've got two lines that have interacted there. Okay, and then same again, I've got a third object here. I'm just going to very quickly do the same, and that comes down like this and does that and comes out again. This is a candlestick, so it's like that. Okay. Hopefully you can see those lines okay. All right, so we have drawn 3 lines. So we're again, it's still quite similar to the charcoal one earlier. We're thinking about reducing things down into their very simple shapes. And we're thinking about the relationship between those lines in the paper. So I really like it when lines, you know, they sort of travel from one end of the paper and come out the other side. So you can see. So it's coming out that side as well. Okay. So we can't really identify the objects. Again, that doesn't matter. And you might use this as a warm-up if you were then going on to a still life and you did want to move towards the children drawing something a bit more representational, because there's no problem with that at all. So long as there's also that sort of almost that caveat or that push against or the alternative is offered as an opportunity whereby they are allowed to look at objects, but to know that what they're not drawing is a perfect representation of them. And then I want to invite you now to just look at the shapes that have been made and just think about how you might fill those shapes. So I'm going to come in quickly with some colour here. And I just invite you to do the same. Just see what marks have been made. And colour works really well for this because, you know, you can then tap into all sorts of conversations about colour theory, but you're talking about the theory side of colour in a much more fun way than doing something like the colour wheel. So you might want to say, okay, we're going to we've made some shapes, we're finding our lines, and we're going to fill them with primary colours. Okay, everyone choose a primary colour, and they will hopefully be able to choose a primary colour. And then you can follow it with, okay, now in your next shape that you have 3, we're going to use a secondary colour. It's not really a secondary colour, I'm using a bit of blue here just to show the example, but you know, it's about them understanding how colours work together. And also you could then say, okay, in the next shape, we're going to mix 2 colours together and see what colour we can make. So in a sort of weaving in and out sort of way, you are teaching skills in colour theory in a way that's, you know, hopefully quite fun and interactive. So I'll just give you a moment to just explore your page, to think about the colours that you like and that appeal to you. And also just to contemplate, can I extend any of the marks I've made to create a new form? So we've started with an object, we've found the shapes, we found the lines, we've seen how they interact. Do you notice anything about the lines? Do any shapes jump out at you? You think, goodness, that looks just like this. Can you see a person emerging? Can you see a landscape emerging? And just explore where some of those lines could take you. And at this point, you know, you might want to, you can have your own reflections right now as you are connecting with the materials in your head. But what's great for children to do is you invite them to reflect on what they're doing as they're doing it, and maybe just to make a few little annotations on their page. You know, things like, I drew this object and it became this object. I made it into this. I like how this line crosses over that line because it makes a shape that looks like whatever. So what you're doing is asking them to inquire about their own piece of artwork. Hopefully that makes sense. I want to make sure I leave a little bit of time at the end for some questions. So, I mean, this activity here, you know, you could spend half an hour doing this. I would say this is a half an hour kind of activity. We've obviously whizzed through it. I wanted to just kind of show you the basics so that you're able to kind of springboard off it, hopefully. All right, so now if you look back at your watercolour, it might hopefully have dried a little bit. If you get it back in front of you, now you'll probably see that the paper's gone a bit bumpy. That's okay. It's quite easy to when we're doing an art lesson, we think, okay, we are doing a printmaking lesson and we're using this, or we're doing a painting lesson and we're using this, or we're doing a drawing and we're using this. But there's so much scope for materials layering over one another. And this activity is one of those. So we've obviously done our sort of abstract circle shape, but whatever it is that you've painted in watercolour, you can do this with. It's about noticing how a dry material interacts with a wet material. If you have got a very puddly page, you might want to just dab away with some tissue, and actually in itself that creates a lovely mark. So I've just gone into the middle slightly because it was a little bit wet. And then I'm returning back to my pastels. You can have pastels, you could use coloured pencils for this. You can get pastel pencils. You can use charcoal, any kind of dry material you can choose. So if you just want to get one of those ready. And then we're just going to have, very simply, have a play to see what the dry material begins to look like over the top of the watercolour. And I would invite you, if you haven't already at some point this morning, to turn whatever it is that you have on its side for a moment. So whether it's the charcoal or a pencil, pastel, just hold it on its side and gently press and move it over. Just work over the top. I've got something. I've got my piece of charcoal. I thought there was something like the Princess and the Pea there. There was my charcoal underneath. Oh, that's better. That pink's lovely. Okay, so I'm just sweeping my pastel around. And there's areas where it's being picked up really well with the paper, and other areas where it's resisting the paper, or the paper's resisting it. And you suddenly see the texture of the paper. Now, this is why watercolour paper is great, because you have such lovely texture to it, which is in itself lovely to bring out. And it's just about inviting that, noticing, the looking, the observation, the reflection. Okay. So just begin to weave your dry material over your watercolour. Just have a play around, work into the shape. Really get in there with your fingers, you know, experiment with smudging. So I've got lots of the lovely grain of the paper showing. I'm going to smudge some of it out, but I'm going to leave areas that are still showing the grain of the paper, just to see what they look like together. And then I've noticed that the bit that sort of come out of the paint circle, it's creating a lovely smudged area outside the paint. What I really like though is how the transparency of that mark, so I can see the watercolour through it. And then all the way behind, I've got this lovely area here of the original watercolour circle that is just pinging out from behind that pink pastel. So we've got a really lovely bright blue and a bright pink here that are really zinging, making each other zing. So this activity is about layering the materials and the process of the physical process of doing that, but then also to looking back through those layers. Okay, what areas where can I still see the watercolour that I first did? Oh yes, I remember that bit of puddle watercolour that I did at the time, and I like the way that it's come through. Or I dabbed that bit away because it was a bit wet, and I like how the texture of the tissue has marked onto the paint, and I might work into that further using a different colour to replicate the marks. I'm now just sort of almost twisting the colour into that texture. Bit of smudging in as well. Now we're doing this purely with form, so we've not decided what this is, and you don't need to decide what it is that you're doing either. You can obviously do this technique with something that they do know what it is, or you do know what it is. So it may be that you've gone outside and the children have painted a sort of a part of, you might have a school garden or a museum garden. They might have gone outside and done some watercolour sketches, and then they might wait for those to dry and then work in some detail over the top using the dry material. So in that case, it might be maybe they might add some grass in. So they're seeing how they can create grass over the top of this watercolour washes that they've done. You could do the same with figures as well. You can do it, you can sort of translate to any kind of context or any subject. So I'll just give you a moment to finish off working into it, and then it would be lovely for you to hold up what you've done in a moment when you're ready. I'll just give you a moment or so. There's an artist that I will send you the link to some of his work in my follow-up, but there's an artist, South African artist called William Kentridge, who some of you may have heard of, who works in a I mean, he doesn't use these colours actually necessarily, but he works a lot with ink and charcoal and does these hugely expressive just these beautiful ink drawings that if you watch videos of him working, it's like, right, get the ink on the page, basically. He has obviously got context, and he has quite a political, quite political in his messaging, and some of his more refined pieces are more representational and uses charcoal and rubs it out and redraws it and makes animations. But there's something about that idea of just getting a material on the paper that is sometimes forgotten as a really, really important part of learning how to do art, learning how to draw, and is absolutely valid and absolutely used by, you know, very, very well established artists who've been using these techniques for many, many years. And it's how they find their message, you know, how they find what it is that they are drawing. So I hope that these activities today have given you a bit of a flavour of how, you know, we might not always know exactly what it is that it's going to end up on the page, but it's through discovering those materials and just getting them on the page that we find it. And I use it myself with I do quite sort of figurative work, and I'm quite interested in stone circles and how the form of a stone can look like a person, and how those two forms can interact, the sort of figure and the stone, and how they move or might be still. And I often begin in that way. I just mark out some watercolour on the paper, just get it straight down there, and then see what kind of forms jump out, and then work into those forms and keep on layering. And then eventually something will come out. It might be completely wrong, you know, I might feel it's not worked and it will get discarded, or not discarded, but put to one side. But it's about encountering those challenges that we best learn. So would everybody like to, if I stop sharing my screen now, I wondered whether anybody would feel comfortable holding up what they've, can I see these beautiful watercolours, see what you've done? Would you be happy to? Oh yes. Lovely. Mel, yours, I love the pink on yours, Mel. Did you work into that with some pencils? Did I see pencil there?
Sorry, it was oil pastel that I used. But what I loved is I was kind of going through the process is those questions that formed. So that kind of what if, what will it look like? And if I went with the kids, I think that's something I'd be promoting quite a bit. What are the questions that you came up with? And just that exploration, really.
Yeah. I think the what if is so critical, and it really is. It's such a great thing to practice, and these activities are a good way to practice that thinking. It's a mindset thing, really, isn't it? And you know, it does take time. It does take time to let go of, you know, no, I want it to look like this, and it's not looking like this, and therefore it's not worked. You know, you know, it is a challenge. Would anybody else like to share any thoughts about how they got on with that activity, or any of the others at all, or anything you found particularly challenging? Or
I think the mindfulness of it's really lovely. Just, I think especially with what you said about like with young people just having a chance to just sit and be still and just make mistakes and have a go. I think that's really important, because just all the work we do, it's always you know, you constantly get, is this right? Is this right? And I hate that I always say to the kids, there's no right or wrong. It's like, it's just, this is about you just exploring and experimenting, and it's good to make mistakes, or what you think are mistakes, because that's how you learn. And but I think just, because like you said, school days are so manic, aren't they? And it's just really nice to just have a bit of calm time, and it's really nice for those kids that aren't academic as well, that because these are the areas where they tend to excel. Just like really go with it, because they know there's no right or wrong. It's just allowing them to just be playful.
And I think having faith and trust that you know, yes, they're playing with materials and not necessarily producing a final refined piece, but having faith that that's okay. And that needs to trickle through the whole school, because I know that's also a challenge. You know, individual teachers may feel that sentiment strongly and believe in it, but it's sometimes harder to for other, you know, for the whole school, the culture of the whole school to really tap into that. But yeah, I think when you strip away you know, objects, and I mean, we've used objects today, but if you strip away sort of that sort of conversation at the beginning of, we are going to be creating this, or you know, this is what we're going to end up with, if you take that away, and instead at the center of it you at least begin with this discovery of the materials and what they can do, then slowly, hopefully, slowly, surely, the children begin to feel a confidence that it's their own, that it's accessing their own sense of creativity and their own voice. And I think
sorry, John's just made a similar comment, and because obviously we can't hear John, but he can hear us. Really enjoyed what we've looked at today. Sometimes I think there is a focus too much on the children drawing a particular thing, and it's what you've just said, you've kind of stripped that away, and whilst you've used an object and you've looked at lines, it hasn't necessarily been representative. So it's more opportunity for children to see that is a creative approach, rather than the representation itself, which isn't good enough because it doesn't look like, I think often is instilled from a very young age.
And that's where the whole sort of looking at other artists becomes so important to that conversation, because historically schools have, you know, there's the sort of the go-to artists that children learn about, but if you start really broadening and widening out and opening out which artists that you are showing those children, then suddenly you realize that there's plenty of artists who work in a way that is process-led. Lots of contemporary artists work in that way. So if you sort of try and forget about Monet's lily pads for a bit, then you know you can actually really discover. And actually, you know, those artists, they did lots of drawing as well, and lots of those drawings would have gone wrong. And it's, you know, it's about sort of reminding them about it's all a process, it's a journey and it's a process. And however well known an artist is, they would have made mistakes along the way.
And Danny put a link to some William Kentridge work at the Royal Academy into chat, so if people want to pick that out. But again, exhibition. I'm conscious of time now. We've kind of flown through that session. We've had thanks from Luke, who's had to go. He's going to definitely put what he's learnt today into an existing art lesson. Great ideas from Rebecca as well. I would say thank you very much, Rachel. I think that was an incredibly informative session and really quite chilled and relaxed, I think, for everybody who was taking part. Lots to take away and apply in a different context. So thank you ever so much.
You're very welcome.
This is number 1 of 3. So our second session is on the 26th of January, and then a third session, and that will be Gemma Fryatt, who's going to run that session looking at kinetic drawing. And then Rachel and Gemma, beg your pardon, will run the third session jointly. So if you haven't signed up for those sessions and you are interested, please go to the Culture Bridge website. They're free. It's an hour and a half out of your day, and I hope you can take away as much from those sessions as you have from this one. But thanks, everybody. Thanks, Rachel. Thank you, Danny, for being around and supporting us. And I hope to see you at Gemma's session on the 26th.